The click of the latch was the final sound. I stood, arms crossed, waiting for the familiar crumble, the desperate apology, but the silence that rushed back in was different now, a true, terrifying void. My mind raced, replaying the argument that, like a runaway train, had started over something insultingly trivial. From there, it had metastasized. I'd escalated, my voice rising as I hurled accusations of complacency, of him being willfully beige, of letting life just happen to him. I painted him as the anchor, heavy and cold, holding down my vibrant, ambitious ship. Usually, this was the point where Cormac would flinch. He'd offer a compromise, his brow furrowed with a gentle anxiety to restore the peace. But not tonight. Tonight, he just stood there, leaning against the counter, his hands loose at his sides. His face was a placid, unreadable mask. There was no anger, no panic, just a profound stillness that felt more dismissive than any shouted retort. It was a wall I couldn't scale, and it infuriated me. In the twisted logic of the fight, his silence wasn't surrender, it was a challenge. A final, insolent stand. And I knew there was only one move left in my playbook, the one I saved for when I absolutely needed to win, to shatter his composure and bring him back into line. It was my trump card, the ultimate reset button. I decided to press it. Cormac was my harbor. That's how I used to describe him to my friends, my sister, anyone who asked. He was steady, reliable, a quiet force of calm in the storm of my life. I was a project manager for a cutthroat tech firm, a job that demanded I be sharp, aggressive, and always in control. I thrived on deadlines, on high-stakes presentations, on bending a chaotic project to my will, and I brought that same energy home. Over our 4 years together, I had unconsciously filed Cormac under managed. His gentle nature, his deep-seated aversion to conflict, I'd relabeled it. In my mind, it wasn't kindness, it was passivity. It wasn't patience, it was a lack of drive. It was a weakness I could leverage. I should have known better, I should have listened. About a year ago, after he'd returned from a weekend visit to his parents' house, he was unusually quiet. That night, the room dark except for the glow of the streetlights outside, he told me about his childhood. He spoke of the suffocating atmosphere of his parents' marriage, a union that never officially ended but was perpetually on the brink. Their life was a miserable cycle of screaming matches where his mother would pack a suitcase or his father would threaten to leave, only for them to fall back into a resentful truce a day later. It was a home built on the threat of its own collapse, he'd said, his voice low and raw. He turned to me then, his eyes searching mine for understanding. I will never live that life, Thea, ever. For me, some words, once they're said, they can't be unsaid. A line, once it's crossed, is crossed forever. I remember nodding, placing a hand on his arm, and saying something empty and reassuring. But I wasn't really listening. I was processing his story as data. My internal monologue was cold and clinical. This is his core trauma. This is the ultimate button. I didn't see his confession as a moment of shared intimacy. I saw it as him handing me the key to his emotional control panel. And I'd pushed that button before, albeit gently. There was the fight over hosting my boss for dinner. Cormac, a talented carpenter, had gotten into a passionate conversation with my boss about woodworking, derailing the shop talk I wanted him to engage in. Later in the kitchen, I'd hissed that I couldn't be with someone who actively sabotaged my career. The threat was veiled, but it was there. He'd apologized and spent the rest of the evening a ghost of himself, smiling blandly. Then there was the argument over buying a ridiculously expensive, cold metallic sculpture. He'd raised valid points about our budget, mentioning the new lathe he was saving for. I'd spun it as him not believing in my taste, my vision for our home. Maybe we just want fundamentally different things, I'd sighed dramatically. The next day, he transferred his lathe savings into our joint account. The sculpture now sits in our living room, a monument to my victory. Each time I got what I wanted. Each time I saw his retreat as a reaffirmation of my control. I never once saw it for what it was, a crack forming in the foundation, spreading silently beneath our feet with every small, coerced surrender. All that history, all those little victories, swirled in my head as I stood there facing his infuriating calm. He wasn't playing his part. He was supposed to be breaking, pleading, doing asterisk something. His stillness felt like a judgment, a quiet refusal to engage in the drama I was directing. My ego, raw and inflamed, couldn't stand it. I needed to regain control, to see that familiar flicker of panic in his eyes that would tell me I still held all the cards. So I gathered all the air in my lungs, weaponizing it. I let the silence stretch for one more beat, making him wait for the killing blow. My heart was pounding, not with fear of loss, but with a sick, adrenaline-fueled sense of purpose. This was the final move, the one that would end the stalemate and force him to concede, not just on the vacation, but on the unspoken power dynamic of our entire relationship. This was checkmate. That's it, I'm done. The words tore out of my throat, sharp and ugly, deliberately crafted to inflict maximum damage. They hung in the air, irrevocable and loud. I am so sick of this, Cormac, this half-life, this beige existence. If you're not going to even try, then what's the point? I threw my hands up in a gesture of pure theatrical despair, a performance for an audience of one. Then I delivered the line I had rehearsed in my mind during 100 smaller frustrations. The line that was the nuclear option, the one I never truly believed I'd use, but now felt was my only remaining weapon. "We're done, I'm breaking up with you." I let the words land with the force of a physical blow. To make the consequences feel immediate and terrifying for him, to leave no room for ambiguity, I added the final, practical threat. "I'll start packing my things tonight, I'll be out by the end of the month." I stood there, arms crossed, chin tilted up defiantly. A part of me was already fast-forwarding to his reaction. The shock, the stammered apology, the desperate promises to change, to be more exciting, to book the flights to Barcelona, to do whatever I wanted. I was waiting for the familiar, comforting crumble. I was waiting for him to beg me to stay. I was waiting to win. Cormac didn't crumble, he didn't flinch, he didn't even blink. The triumphant smirk I had prepared died on my lips. He just stood there for a long moment, and the very quality of the silence in the room shifted. It wasn't tense anymore, it was hollow. He looked at me, and for the first time all night, I saw something change deep in his eyes. It wasn't the panic I craved. It was an emotion I couldn't immediately identify, something ancient and weary, like a deep, settled sorrow that had been there for a very long time. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming a long-held hypothesis. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. My first thought was a flash of triumphant annoyance. He's going to the bedroom to sulk, to give me the silent treatment before he comes back and apologizes. I held my pose, arms crossed, ready to let him stew in it for a good 10 minutes before I would magnanimously accept his surrender. I listened for the sound of a slammed door, for some sign of the emotional turmoil I had intended to cause. There was none. He was only gone for about 30 seconds. He reappeared in the doorway, his steps measured and calm. He was carrying something, a gray, hard-shelled suitcase. It was his, the one he used for longer trips, the one he'd taken to his brother's wedding last year. I noticed a thin layer of dust coating the top, suggesting it hadn't been moved from its spot in the back of the closet in a long time. My mind fumbled, trying to process the image. The scene wasn't following my script. Is he packing my things for me? Is this some kind of bizarre, passive-aggressive gesture, an attempt to call my bluff? He walked over and placed the suitcase on the floor between us. He didn't drop it, he set it down gently, the soft click of the plastic feet on the hardwood floor echoing in the cavernous silence. It landed with a weight that felt both physical and symbolic. Then he looked up, meeting my gaze directly. His own eyes were clear, devoid of the anger or hurt I expected. They were just calm, resigned. He spoke, and his voice was not the one I knew. It was quiet, steady, and held the chilling finality of a judge reading a verdict that had been decided long ago. "I accepted this was going to happen 6 months ago, Thea," he said, his tone even and devoid of any accusation. "I've just been waiting for you to be the one to say it." His words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. My brain tried to parse them, but they felt like a foreign language. 6 months ago, waiting for me, it didn't make any sense. This was my power play, my decision, my ultimatum. He wasn't supposed to have a pre-written response. Before I could form a coherent thought, he turned, walked to the small table by the door where we kept our keys, and picked up his car keys and his wallet. He slipped his worn leather jacket on, the one I always said made him look like a handsome professor. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried, as if he were simply leaving for the grocery store. He didn't look back at the life we had built, the photos on the wall, the sculpture I'd insisted on, the whole curated world of us. He just walked to the door. "Cormac, wait," I stammered, the words sounding weak and pathetic. He paused with his hand on the doorknob but didn't turn around. "Goodbye, Thea," he said to the door. Then he opened it, stepped through, and closed it softly behind him. The click of the latch was the final sound. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the closed door, my arms still crossed in a ridiculous posture of defiance. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It was a true, terrifying void. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow, leaving me dizzy. My first instinct was denial, quickly followed by a surge of indignant rage. He's bluffing. This is a countermove. He's driving around the block and will be back in 5 minutes to see me crying. But 5 minutes passed. Then 10, the rage began to curdle into a slick, cold panic. I snatched my phone, my fingers fumbling as I pulled up his contact. I hit call. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. My heart hammered against my ribs. He blocked me. I tried again, same result. I switched to texting, my thumbs flying across the screen. "This is insane. You can't just leave. Come back and talk to me." The message indicator stayed on sending for a moment before turning into that dreaded red exclamation point. "Not delivered." I checked our shared social media accounts. I couldn't find his profile. He had blocked me everywhere, systematically, instantly. My eyes fell on the suitcase. It sat there like an unexploded bomb. With a trembling hand, I knelt and unzipped it. Inside, my carefully constructed reality fell apart. It wasn't a random collection of things. It was a meticulously packed go bag. There was a neat stack of clothes, 2 pairs of jeans, a few t-shirts, a warm sweater. A dop kit held his toothbrush, razor, and deodorant. Tucked into the side pocket was his favorite book, a worn copy of a poetry collection, and beneath it, a small, framed photo of him and his late grandmother. It was the one he kept on his nightstand, the one he'd told me he'd grab if the house were on fire. This wasn't an impulsive act. This was a planned evacuation. The next 3 days were a blur of frantic energy and hollowing silence. The apartment felt vast and wrong, every empty space a testament to his absence. I kept expecting to hear his key in the door, to see him walk in with a sheepish look, ready to admit he'd overreacted. But the only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart. The panic had set in, a constant, low-grade hum beneath my skin. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I paced the floor, replaying the scene over and over, my anger warring with a growing, terrifying dread. On the 4th day, unable to bear the echoing quiet any longer, I called my older sister, Maya. I presented my case like a lawyer arguing for an appeal, carefully editing the narrative to paint myself as the wronged party. "He just left, Maya," I said, my voice cracking with manufactured tears. "We had a fight, just a stupid fight about a vacation, and he just walked out. He packed a bag. He blocked my number. It's insane. He's being so cruel, so dramatic." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I expected sympathy, outrage on my behalf, a chorus of "what a jerk." Instead, Maya's voice was quiet and measured when she finally spoke. "Thea," she said, and her tone was not gentle, "was this the first time you've had a stupid fight?" "What do you mean?" I asked defensively. "I mean, how many times have you pushed him to his breaking point to get your way? Be honest." Her question hung in the air, sharp and unwelcome. "That's not fair," I mumbled. "Isn't it?" She pressed on, her voice losing its patience. "Remember that time you threatened to skip his family's Christmas because he didn't want to spend $1,000 on a new coat for you? Or the time you told him his passion for carpentry was a cute hobby, but not something a grown man should be so invested in?" She took a breath, and her next words landed like a punch to the gut. "And Thea, do you remember what he told you about his parents? About the one thing he said he could never, ever tolerate in a relationship?" Ice flooded my veins. His words from that night, the ones I had filed away as strategic data, came rushing back with horrifying clarity. "A line, once it's crossed, is crossed forever." "He wasn't being dramatic, Thea," Maya said, her voice softening slightly but still firm. "He was being consistent. You're the one who kept testing the fence, rattling it to see if it was electrified. You finally touched it. Don't act surprised that you got burned." The call ended, and I was left in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the ghosts of my own words, my own actions. Maya hadn't given me absolution, she had handed me a mirror, and for the first time I was forced to look at the reflection. A month crawled by, an entire month of silence. I had moved beyond panic and into a state of dull, aching resignation. The apartment was a museum of my failure. Every object held a memory I now saw through a different lens. The expensive sculpture in the living room no longer looked like a victory, but a monument to my bullying. One afternoon, sorting through a pile of mail that had accumulated on the kitchen counter, I saw it. A plain white envelope from his bank addressed to Cormac MacLeod. In the corner, a yellow sticker from the post office read, "Address correction and forwarding." Below it was a new address, printed in stark, impersonal block letters. An address across town in a neighborhood I barely knew. For a moment, I just stared at it. It was a tangible piece of his new life, a life that had been running parallel to my miserable one, completely separate. A sick, desperate curiosity took hold. I told myself it was to get closure, to just see asterisk, but I knew it was something uglier. A need to prove he couldn't be okay without me. That evening, I found myself driving through unfamiliar streets. I parked at the end of a quiet, tree-lined road, my engine off, my hands clammy on the steering wheel. The address belonged to a modest, 2-story apartment building with clean lines and large windows. And then I saw him. He was getting out of his car, the same beat-up Subaru he loved. He was carrying a large, leafy potted plant, holding it carefully in both arms. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, and he looked calm. A neighbor, a woman walking her dog, stopped to say hello. Cormac smiled, a real easy smile that reached his eyes. It was a smile I hadn't seen in so long, I'd almost forgotten it existed. He laughed at something she said, a genuine, unburdened sound that the wind carried to my car. He looked healthy, he looked peaceful, he looked free. In that single, devastating moment, I understood everything. His leaving wasn't a punishment for me. It was an act of salvation for him. He hadn't run away from me in anger, he had walked calmly and deliberately toward his own peace. The suitcase hadn't been a threat, it had been a promise he made to himself. He disappeared inside the building, and I was left alone in my car, the truth finally settling in my bones, heavy and cold as stone. I had lost him, not in a fiery explosion, but in a quiet final click of a door. I had lost him months, maybe even a year, before I ever shouted those final, stupid words. I drove home in a daze, the image of his easy smile burned into my mind. The fight had gone out of me, replaced by the hollow, echoing certainty of my own fault. He was gone. He was happy it was over. I sat in my car in the dark, in the parking spot next to the empty one that used to be his, and finally I let myself cry. Not the performative, angry tears of a victim, but the gut-wrenching, silent sobs of someone who has finally understood the magnitude of what they have thrown away. It was all my fault. I had taken a good, kind man and systematically dismantled his peace for my own selfish sport. This crushing emptiness was the consequence. It was what I deserved. And yet, even as the wave of self-loathing washed over me, a tiny, ugly thought surfaced from the depths. A little whisper from the most selfish, unrepentant part of my soul. But if he had just fought for me just that once, maybe it would have been different. The thought was fleeting, but it was there. A final, pathetic attempt to shift a fraction of the blame. And its existence, even in the face of my overwhelming regret, was the most damning evidence of all. It was the part of me Cormac had finally saved himself from,